Have you ever watched a 400-pound nylon dragon wheeze its last breath while a middle-aged woman named Brenda takes notes on a clipboard? I have. It's devastating. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the pristine, aggressively manicured suburbs of Des Moines, Iowa. The kind of neighborhood where the grass is cut to a mathematically precise 2.5 inches, where the mailboxes all perfectly match, and where joy goes to die quietly behind closed beige blinds. I was standing on my back patio, holding a half-empty can of sparkling water, bearing witness to a murder. The victim was a 15-foot-tall, vibrantly obnoxious, commercial-grade inflatable castle featuring a rather dopey-looking medieval dragon scaling its primary turret. I had bought it used from a failing party rental company for $300, and for the past week, it had been the crown jewel of my backyard. It was meant for my nephew's upcoming birthday party, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't spent at least 2 evenings bouncing in it myself, purely out of spite for the grim, sterile environment of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. But now, the dragon was dying. The massive yellow industrial blower motor, which usually hummed with the aggressive energy of a small jet engine, had been forcefully unplugged. The sudden silence in the yard was deafening, quickly replaced by the sad, wet-sounding crinkle of heavy-duty vinyl collapsing in on itself. The bright orange turrets folded inward, the dragon's neck snapped at a tragic 90-degree angle, its painted eyes staring blankly at my meticulously stamped concrete patio as it descended into a colorful, wrinkled puddle on my lawn. Standing triumphantly over the corpse of my joy was Brenda. Brenda was the president of the Whispering Pines HOA, a title she treated with the gravity of a wartime general. She was a woman who communicated entirely in passive-aggressive sighs and strongly worded memos printed on pastel paper. Today, she was wearing a sensible beige pantsuit that perfectly matched her personality, and a pair of orthotic walking shoes that silently screamed, "I will absolutely measure your lawn with a wooden ruler." "It really is an eyesore, David," Brenda said, not looking up from her silver clipboard as her pen scratched violently across a violation form. "I don't even know what you were thinking. A primary color palette? In Whispering Pines? It's completely out of compliance with the earth tone mandates." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "It's a bounce house, Brenda. It's not a permanent architectural installation. It's an inflatable toy. It's literally filled with nothing but the ambient air of Des Moines." "It's a nuisance," she snapped back, her eyes narrowing as she finally looked at me. She stepped over a deflated nylon drawbridge, moving closer to the patio edge. "And more importantly, as of the emergency board meeting last night, it is strictly prohibited. I warned you on Sunday that we were taking action." "You held an emergency board meeting on a Monday night to ban a balloon?" I asked, genuinely trying to wrap my head around the sheer scale of her pettiness. "Did you use the neighborhood emergency broadcast system? Was there a siren?" Brenda's lips thinned into a tight, white line. She hated when I didn't take her seriously, which was, unfortunately for her, all the time. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and produced a freshly laminated piece of pink paper, thrusting it toward my chest. I didn't reach for it, letting it flutter to the patio table between us. "You can mock the process all you want, David, but the bylaws are the bylaws," she said, her voice trembling with that specific kind of suburban righteous indignation. "We drafted a new amendment, passed with a unanimous vote. The board has officially banned all temporary structures from visible backyards, and since your property backs up to the communal golf path, your yard is considered visible." I looked down at the pink slip. It was a formal citation, complete with a terrifyingly detailed breakdown of my alleged crimes against neighborhood aesthetics. Temporary structures, I read aloud, picking up the paper. Including but not limited to tents, gazebos, event canopies, and, wow, you actually put this in writing, inflatable recreational devices operating via continuous forced air blowers. I looked back up at her, genuinely impressed by the bureaucratic venom. You really did your homework on the forced air part. I consulted with our legal liaison, she said smugly, adjusting her clipboard against her hip. The phrasing is airtight. No loopholes. You have until Friday at 5 p.m. to permanently remove that monstrosity from the premises, or the association will begin levying a fine of $500 per day. If you fail to pay, we will place a lien on your property. Have a pleasant afternoon. She didn't wait for a response. She simply executed a flawless military about-face in her orthotic shoes and marched across my lawn, crushing the dragon's snout beneath her heel as she made her way back toward the property line. I stood there for a long time after she left, watching the wind catch the loose edges of the deflated castle. $500 a day. A lien on my house. Over a bounce house. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I wasn't even mad about the money, honestly. It was the principle of the thing. The absolute unyielding arrogance of a group of bored neighbors deciding they had the legal authority to police joy. They didn't just want the inflatable gone, they wanted to flex. They wanted to prove that their interpretation of an earth tone mandate superseded my right to have a brightly colored dragon on a piece of land I paid a mortgage on. I sat down in one of my patio chairs, the pink citation slip resting on the glass table in front of me. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache brewing just behind my eyes. I could just pack it up. It would take 20 minutes to roll the vinyl into a manageable cylinder, shove it into the back of the garage, and let Brenda win. It was the logical choice. It was the easy choice. But I didn't buy a house in the suburbs to be easy. I bought it to be left alone. And if Brenda wanted to use legal jargon to force my hand, I was going to have to figure out how to use it right back. I picked up the citation again. Banned all temporary structures. Temporary. That was the key word. She was incredibly proud of that phrasing. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in my home office, bathed in the glow of dual monitors, diving into the most excruciatingly boring reading material known to modern man. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, Master Covenant, and Declarations. The binder was massive, a literal 2-inch thick tome of misery that I had shoved into a desk drawer the day I closed on the house and hadn't looked at since. I flipped through pages of regulations concerning the exact approved shades of beige for exterior trim, the maximum allowable height for ornamental lawn gnomes, 14 inches, strictly enforced, and the exact times of year one was legally permitted to display holiday lighting. Finally, I found the section Brenda had updated, Section 14, Paragraph B. No temporary structure, including but not limited to tents, gazebos, event canopies, and inflatable recreational devices operating via continuous forced air blowers, shall be erected, placed, or maintained on any lot where visible from common areas. It was a solid piece of neighborhood legislation. She wasn't wrong about that. If I tried to argue that the bounce house wasn't temporary, I'd lose. By its very nature, you plug it in, it inflates, you unplug it, it goes away. It was the dictionary definition of a temporary structure. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I needed a way around the word temporary. I scrolled down to the end of Section 14, reading the finer print, the foundational definitions the HOA relied on to enforce their rules. And right there, buried at the bottom of page 142, was a single sentence that made my heart skip a beat. For all matters concerning the definition, classification, and structural integrity of outbuildings and accessory structures, the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association strictly defers to the definitions set forth in the Des Moines Municipal Zoning and Building Code. Brenda had made a critical, fatal error. In her desperate, power-hungry rush to ensure her bylaws were airtight and legally enforceable, she hadn't bothered to invent her own definition for what constituted a permanent structure versus a temporary one. She had outsourced the definition to the city of Des Moines. She assumed that by tying the HOA rules to the city rules, she was backing up her authority with the power of local government. She had no idea what she had just handed me. I immediately dropped the HOA binder on the floor and opened a new tab on my browser, pulling up the official City of Des Moines municipal website. Navigating a city government website is like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach in the dark. But after 20 minutes of furious clicking, I finally found the master PDF for the Municipal Building Code. I hit Ctrl+F and typed in permanent structure. I started reading, scanning through the dense legal and architectural jargon. According to the city, a temporary structure was indeed defined as anything resting on the ground without a foundation, designed to be easily moved, erected, or dismantled. Tents, sheds, sitting on dirt, and yes, inflatables. But the definition for a permanent accessory structure was incredibly specific. To be classified as a permanent accessory structure within a residential zoning district, the structure must meet the following criteria. 1. The structure must be permanently anchored to a continuous concrete footing or foundation. 2. Said foundation must extend below the local designated frost line, 42 inches deep in Polk County, to prevent frost heaving. 3. If the structure utilizes electrical power, said power must be hardwired directly into the primary residence's electrical grid via an underground, code-compliant trench, rather than relying on temporary extension cords or plug-in receptacles. I read it once. I read it twice. I read it a third time, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. I looked out my office window, down into the backyard where the sad, deflated pile of nylon lay on the grass. Brenda wanted to ban temporary structures. She wanted to use the city's definitions to enforce her will. According to the city of Des Moines, if a structure isn't temporary, it's permanent. And the only thing separating a temporary structure from a permanent one was 36 inches of concrete, some heavy-duty wedge anchors, and an electrician. I felt a slow, sinister grin spread across my face. I didn't just want to keep the bounce house anymore. That wasn't enough. I wanted to build a monument to malicious compliance. I wanted to create something so legally bulletproof, so aggressively permanent, that Brenda would have to stare at it for the rest of her natural life in Whispering Pines, knowing she was the one who wrote the rule that made it possible. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. I needed to act fast. I had until Friday at 5 p.m. before the fines started rolling in. It was currently Tuesday evening. That gave me exactly 3 days to pull a city permit, dig a massive hole in my backyard, pour a commercial-grade foundation, and bolt a child's toy to the earth with the kind of structural integrity usually reserved for retaining walls. It was absolute madness. It was going to be expensive. It was going to ruin my week. But as I looked at that pink citation slip sitting on my desk, I knew I had never been more committed to a construction project in my entire life. Brenda wanted permanent? I was going to give her permanent. I mean, Wednesday morning hit, and I was up at like 6 a.m., chugging black coffee and staring at a hastily drawn blueprint I had sketched on the back of a utility bill. The plan was legally sound, but practically it was completely unhinged. I needed a contractor, and I needed one who wouldn't ask too many questions or, try to have me committed. I started making calls at exactly 7. The first 3 went about as well as you'd expect when you're trying to hire a professional construction crew for a backyard gag. "Apex Concrete, this is Gary," a gruff voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey Gary, I need a foundation poured, ASAP. Like, tomorrow morning, ASAP, I said, trying to sound as professional as possible. "I'm looking at a 15 by 15 foot pad, but it needs to be up to municipal code for a permanent structure, meaning continuous footings below the 42-inch frost line, rebar reinforced, the whole 9 yards. Gary let out a low whistle. 42 inches deep for a 15 by 15? What are you building back there, buddy? A bank vault? A bomb shelter? It's for an accessory structure, I hedged. Yeah, but what kind? Shed? Detached garage? You putting a car lift in it? Because if it's load-bearing for vehicles, I gotta change the mix. It's not for vehicles, Gary. It's for a bounce house. There was a dead, empty silence on the line. I could hear a truck engine idling in the background on his end. What?" he finally asked, his voice entirely flat. "A commercial-grade inflatable castle. I need it permanently anchored to the Earth's crust." Gary hung up on me. Honestly, I couldn't even blame him. The next guy told me to stop prank calling his business line. The third guy quoted me a rush fee of $25,000, which was basically his polite way of telling me to screw off. By 8:30, I was starting to sweat. Brenda's Friday deadline was ticking away, and my plan was entirely dependent on finding someone crazy enough to pour industrial amounts of cement for a nylon dragon. Then, I called Mike. Mike's business card had been shoved in my mailbox a few months prior. It just said, "Mike's Concrete and Excavation," in plain black text, no logo, no website. When he answered, he sounded like a guy who had been smoking 2 packs a day since the Carter administration. I gave him the exact same pitch, the dimensions, the frost line requirement, the rush timeline. And bracing myself for the dial tone, the actual purpose of the foundation. "A bounce house," Mike repeated slowly. The gravel in his voice made it sound like a threat. "Yes, a bounce house. Look, Mike, I'm locked in a legal death match with my HOA president, and I need to permanently integrate a child's inflatable toy into the municipal electrical and structural grid to circumvent a temporary structure ban. I have the cash. I just need the concrete." Mike didn't hang up. He didn't laugh. He just breathed heavily into the receiver for about 10 seconds. "Buddy," Mike said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper, "I hate my HOA with the fire of 1,000 suns. They made me take down my ham radio tower in 2006. I'm still salty about it. Where do you live?" 45 minutes later, a beat-up Ford F250, that looked like it had survived a minor war, rolled up my pristine driveway, leaking a tiny drop of oil onto the bleached concrete. Mike stepped out. He was a massive guy, wearing stained Carhartt overalls, a faded Union hat, and a pair of steel-toed boots that had seen better decades. He walked into my backyard, took one look at the deflated dragon, and then looked at the property line where Brenda's perfectly manicured rose bushes sat. "So, she's the one, huh?" Mike asked, pointing a calloused finger toward Brenda's house. "That's the enemy territory, yes," I confirmed. Mike pulled a tape measure from his belt and started aggressively pacing out the dimensions on the grass. 15 by 15, 42-inch trench around the perimeter for the frost footing. You want a solid slab in the middle, reinforced with steel mesh, and half-inch galvanized wedge anchors sunk into the wet pour, so you can bolt the D-rings of that nylon contraption down? Exactly, I said, feeling a rush of hope. And it needs an underground conduit trench running from the pad to my house's electrical panel. I have an electrician coming this afternoon to pull the permit for the hardwire, but he needs the trench dug before he can lay the PVC. Mike paused, kicking at the dirt. You realize this is going to obliterate this section of your lawn, right? Like, total devastation. The mini excavator is going to tear up the sod, and the concrete trucks are going to leave ruts. Mike, I do not care if this backyard looks like the surface of the moon. I just care that by Friday at 5 p.m., this structure is legally permanent. Mike pulled a crumpled notepad from his pocket and scribbled some numbers. It's a rush job. I gotta pull a guy off a driveway poor in West Des Moines. I gotta rent a trencher. I gotta bribe the concrete dispatcher to squeeze in a truck for tomorrow morning. It's gonna run you $8,000. Guess your certified check. I didn't even blink. I'll go to the bank right now. You do that, Mike grinned, showing a chipped front tooth. And you better get your ass down to the municipal building and pull a fast-track permit for an accessory structure foundation. They usually take weeks, but if you go down there and bother them enough, you might find a clerk willing to stamp it today just to get you to leave. The municipal building in downtown Des Moines was exactly as depressing as you'd imagine. It smelled like floor wax and crushed dreams. I pulled a number ticket and sat in a plastic chair for 2 hours, rehearsing my pitch. When they finally called my number, I practically sprinted to the plexiglass window. The clerk, a woman named Shirley, who looked like she was actively counting down the seconds until her retirement, stared at me over her reading glasses. Permit application, I said, sliding the paperwork under the glass. Fast Track Residential Accessory Structure Foundation. Shirley adjusted her glasses and looked at the form. You left the building type blank. Is this a shed? A gazebo? A greenhouse? It's, a customized, air-supported, flexible architectural canopy, I lied smoothly. Technically, it wasn't a lie. It was just heavily seasoned truth. Uh-huh, Shirley deadpanned. And why do you need a continuous frost-line footing for a canopy? High wind area, I said without missing a beat. I need maximum structural rigidity. She sighed. The kind of heavy, soul-crushing sigh that only government employees can truly master. She looked at the diagrams Mike had hastily drawn for me, then at the electrical permit application my electrician had emailed over. You're running a dedicated 20-amp underground circuit for a canopy? She asked. It has, integrated climate control systems. The blower motor. Basically climate control. Shirley looked at me. I looked at Shirley. There was a moment of silent understanding between us. She knew I was full of it, and I knew she didn't get paid enough to care. She aggressively stamped the paperwork with a loud thwack, scribbled her initials, and slid it back under the glass. Have a nice day, sir. Try not to blow away. I walked out of that building holding the golden ticket, a fully approved, legally binding municipal permit for a permanent accessory foundation. Brenda's HOA rules meant absolutely nothing now. I had the city on my side. Thursday morning arrived with the subtlety of a freight train crashing through a china shop. At exactly 7 a.m., the peaceful, bird-song-filled silence of Whispering Pines was violently shattered by the roar of a diesel engine. I was standing on my patio, holding a mug of coffee, watching with pure, unadulterated glee as Mike backed a flatbed trailer up my driveway. Strapped to the trailer was a bright yellow Bobcat mini excavator. Mike unchained the beast, fired it up, and drove it straight across my lawn, its rubber tracks chewing through the perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass. The noise was glorious. It was the sound of victory. It was also, apparently, the sound of Brenda's worst nightmare. Before Mike even had the bucket in the dirt, the sliding glass door of Brenda's house whipped open. She came storming out in a pink velour tracksuit, her hair wrapped in a towel, looking absolutely unhinged. She didn't even use the sidewalk. She just marched straight through her rose bushes, ignoring the thorns catching on her pants, and stomped right up to my property line. "David!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the idle of the excavator. "Turn that machine off right now." I took a slow sip of coffee, savoring the roast. I casually strolled over to the property line, stopping exactly 1 inch from the invisible boundary that separated my yard from the communal golf path. "Morning, Brenda. Beautiful day for some landscaping, isn't it?" "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the bobcat. Mike had just plunged the steel bucket into the earth, ripping up a massive chunk of sod and dirt to start the perimeter trench. "You are violating noise ordinances. You are violating the earth tone mandates. You are destroying the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood." "Actually," I said, pulling a folded piece of paper from my back pocket, "I am commencing permitted construction on a permanent accessory structure." Brenda froze. Her eyes darted from the machine back to me. "Permanent? You don't have approval from the Architectural Review Committee." "I'm the head of the committee, and I certainly didn't approve an addition." "Ah, well, here's the fun part," I said, unfolding the paper. I deliberately held it up, showing her the bright red municipal approval stamp. "According to the bylaws you forced through on Monday, the HOA strictly defers to the Des Moines Municipal Zoning and Building Code for the definition and classification of all outbuildings. I went to the city yesterday. They approved my foundation. I am legally bound by the municipal code to complete this pour. To stop now would be a code violation." Brenda stared at the permit, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You're pouring concrete? For that circus tent?" "It's not a tent, Brenda. Tents are temporary. As per your own citation, temporary structures are banned. So I am making it permanent. I'm sinking a frost line footing and hardwiring it to the grid. It's going to be a fixture of this property forever. When I eventually sell this house, the real estate listing is going to say 3 beds, 2 baths, and an attached medieval dragon." The sheer horror washing over her face was a masterpiece. It belonged in a museum. She looked at the massive trench Mike was digging. She looked at the pile of dirt accumulating on my lawn. And then she lost it. "I'm calling the police!" she yelled, spinning around. "You are a menace, David. This is illegal construction. I will have you arrested." She stormed back to her house, violently pulling her phone from her pocket. I just smiled and waved. "Tell them to bring coffee. Mike takes it black." By 9:30 a.m., my backyard looked like an active war zone. Mike and his crew had dug a massive, perfectly square trench around the perimeter of the designated area, hitting the required 42-inch depth. The center was dug out and filled with compacted gravel. They were currently hauling in massive sheets of steel rebar mesh, laying it out like a grid and tying it together with wire. In the corner of the yard, my electrician, a lanky guy named Steve, who found this entire situation deeply amusing, was operating a motorized ditch witch. He was cutting a narrow, 2-foot-deep trench straight from the foundation pad all the way to the side of my house, right up to the exterior electrical panel. He was laying gray PVC conduit, threading thick copper wiring through it, preparing to install a weatherproof junction box directly into the center of the concrete pad. The neighborhood was in an absolute uproar. I could see faces peeking out from behind blinds up and down the street. A few of the braver neighbors had walked their dogs past my house 3 or 4 times just to stare at the chaos. And then, right on cue, the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the siding of my house. A Des Moines police department cruiser pulled up in front of my driveway, blocking in Mike's truck. 2 officers stepped out. One was older, looking tired and sunburned. The other was younger and looked like he was taking this way too seriously. I would later learn their names were Officer Miller and Officer Davis, respectively. Brenda, who had apparently been lying in wait in her front window, came sprinting out of her house before the officers even had their doors shut. She had changed out of her bathrobe and was now wearing her serious business blazer, clutching her silver clipboard like a shield. "Officers, finally!" she yelled, power-walking toward them. "You need to shut this down immediately. He is conducting unapproved, illegal excavations and operating heavy machinery without HOA consent." I casually set down my coffee mug on the patio table and walked around the side of the house to meet them in the driveway. "Morning, officers," I said, leaning casually against my mailbox. "Can I help you?" Officer Miller, the older cop, sighed and rested his thumbs on his duty belt. He looked past me, taking in the sight of the mini-excavator, the massive pile of dirt, and the 3 construction workers in my backyard. "Sir, we received a call about illegal construction and a noise complaint," Miller said, his tone perfectly neutral. "Do you have a permit for this excavation?" "Absolutely," I said, pulling the permit out of my pocket and handing it to him. Miller took the paper, put on a pair of reading glasses, and scanned the document. He looked at the red stamp. He looked at the signature. He looked back at me. "Says here you're pouring a foundation for an accessory structure," Miller muttered. "Looks perfectly in order to me." "It is not in order," Brenda interrupted, stepping into the officer's personal space. She was vibrating with rage. "He is trying to build a foundation for a children's bounce house. It violates the HOA Master Covenant. It's an eyesore. It's a spite project. You have to stop him." The younger cop, Officer Davis, raised an eyebrow. "Wait, a bounce house?" "Yes," Brenda shrieked. "He's pouring 3 feet of concrete for a balloon." Miller looked at me, a tiny, barely there smirk, tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that true, sir?" "The structure's purpose is irrelevant to the building code, officer," I said calmly, adopting my best bureaucratic tone. "The municipal permit dictates the structural requirements for a permanent foundation. I am simply complying with the strict safety standards set forth by the city of Des Moines. Whatever structure I choose to bolt to those anchors once the concrete cures is my business, provided it doesn't violate city zoning laws. And last I checked, there's no municipal ordinance against vibrant primary colors." Miller handed the permit back to me. He looked at Brenda, his expression returning to flat exhaustion. "Ma'am, he has a valid city permit. His contractors are operating within legal working hours. The noise is temporary construction noise, which is exempt from the daytime nuisance ordinances. There is absolutely nothing illegal happening here." "But the HOA bylaws," Brenda insisted, aggressively tapping her clipboard. "He doesn't have Architectural Review Committee approval." "That," Miller said, taking a step back toward his cruiser, "is a civil matter. The police department doesn't enforce HOA bylaws. If you have a problem with his construction, you need to take it up with a civil court judge. We can't arrest a man for pouring concrete on his own property with a city permit." "You are completely useless!" Brenda yelled, losing whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. "I pay your salary. I demand you issue a stop work order." Miller's face hardened. "Ma'am, if you continue to yell at me and obstruct my duties, I will issue you a citation for disturbing the peace. Now, I suggest you go back inside your house and call a lawyer if you're so inclined, because we are leaving." Brenda looked like she was going to spontaneously combust. Her face went from pale to a deep, dangerous shade of purple. She opened her mouth to scream again, but Officer Miller simply turned his back on her, got into the cruiser, and shut the door. Officer Davis gave me a small, silent nod of respect before getting into the passenger seat. They backed out and drove away, leaving Brenda standing in the street, clutching her clipboard like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. I leaned over the property line. "Hey, Brenda," I said softly. She snapped her head toward me, her eyes filled with venom. "The cement trucks arrive in an hour. You might want to close your windows. It gets pretty dusty." She didn't say a word. She just turned and stomped back to her house, slamming her front door so hard I heard the glass rattle. At exactly 11 a.m., the ground began to shake. The rumble of the heavy-duty concrete mixer rolling down the quiet suburban street of Whispering Pines was like the rolling thunder of impending doom. The sheer size of the truck looked absurd against the backdrop of the delicate, manicured lawns and ornamental cherry trees. It backed into my driveway, the massive steel drum spinning slowly, churning 10 yards of wet, heavy concrete. Mike was waiting for it. He and his crew had laid out wooden form boards around the top of the trench to create a clean edge for the slab. Steve, the electrician, had successfully run the conduit and mounted a heavy-duty, weatherproof electrical box right in the center of the gravel pit, perfectly positioned to align with where the blower motor would sit. "All right, let's get it wet," Mike yelled over the roar of the truck's engine. The driver pulled a lever, and the massive chute swung out over the trench. Thick, gray sludge began pouring out in a heavy, continuous flow, filling the deep frost-line footings first. It was a beautiful sight. Every cubic inch of concrete that hit the dirt was another nail in the coffin of Brenda's authority. I stood on the patio, watching the crew work with absolute precision. They used massive steel rakes to push the concrete into the corners, ensuring it flowed around the rebar mesh. They worked fast, sweat pouring off their faces in the midday heat. Within 45 minutes, the entire 15 by 15 area was filled. Then came the finishing process. They used a large wooden screed board to level the surface, pulling it back and forth across the wet concrete. Next, Mike grabbed a magnesium bull float, basically a giant trowel attached to a long pole, and began pushing it across the surface, smoothing out the rough spots and bringing a layer of cement paste to the top. "All right, give it 20 minutes to bleed the water out, then we sink the anchors," Mike shouted to his crew. He walked over to the patio, wiping his forehead with a dirty rag. He looked at the massive, smooth gray square sitting in the middle of my torn-up lawn. "I gotta tell you, man," Mike said, shaking his head. "I've built foundations for auto shops, industrial freezers, and $500,000 home additions. But this is a masterpiece of spite. It is beautiful." "It's not just spite, Mike," I laughed. "It's legal compliance. It's the American way." When the concrete had set just enough to hold its shape but was still pliable, Mike pulled out a massive box of 1/2-inch galvanized steel wedge anchors. These were the kind of bolts you use to secure heavy machinery to a factory floor. We unrolled the deflated dragon just enough to map out exactly where the heavy-duty D-ring tie-downs were located on the corners and along the sides of the structure. Mike meticulously measured and pushed 12 massive steel bolts deep into the wet concrete, leaving just the threaded ends and the heavy hex nuts protruding above the surface. By 3 p.m., the crew was packing up their tools. The concrete was poured. The anchors were set. The electrical box was permanently integrated into the slab. Mike handed me a final invoice, which I gladly paid, adding a generous tip for the sheer speed of the job. It takes about 24 hours to cure enough to walk on, and a few days to reach full strength, Mike warned me as he climbed into his truck. Don't try bolting that thing down until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. You torque those nuts too early, you'll rip the bolts right out of the green concrete. Understood, I said. Tomorrow afternoon? Friday deadline is 5 p.m. I've got plenty of time. Mike drove off, leaving me alone with a massive, steaming square of wet concrete in my backyard. The neighborhood was dead silent again, but it was a tense silence. The kind of silence that precedes a massive storm. I spent Thursday evening sitting in a lawn chair, literally watching concrete dry. I drank a beer, I ordered a pizza. I occasionally glanced over at Brenda's house, noting that the blinds in her upstairs window were slightly parted. She was watching me. She was waiting for me to fail. She was probably drafting a new, even more unhinged HOA amendment at that very moment. But it didn't matter. The trap was set. The legal loophole had been exploited, heavily reinforced with steel rebar, and poured with 10 yards of industrial-strength cement. Friday morning dawned bright, clear, and uncomfortably hot. The deadline was looming. I went out to the backyard and cautiously stepped onto the slab. It was solid, rock hard. The surface was a pristine, chalky gray, and the steel anchor bolts stuck out of the concrete like little monuments of defiance. It was time to resurrect the dragon. I dragged the heavy, cumbersome vinyl roll to the center of the pad. It took me an hour of sweating, grunting, and fighting with the thick material to get it properly oriented. The inflatable was massive, requiring every inch of the 15 by 15 pad. Once it was laid out, I started the anchoring process. I dragged the heavy nylon straps attached to the D-rings over the protruding steel bolts. I dropped a heavy-duty washer over each bolt, threaded on the hex nuts, and grabbed a massive socket wrench. I went around the perimeter, tightening each nut down until it was completely, undeniably bolted to the earth. You could have hit this thing with a semi-truck, and it wouldn't have moved an inch. Next was the electrical. Steve, the electrician, had left me a heavy-duty, outdoor-rated pigtail connector. I dragged the massive yellow blower motor to the center of the pad, aligning it with the intake tube of the bounce house. Instead of plugging it into an extension cord like a normal, sane person, I wired the motor directly into the junction box Steve had installed in the concrete. I used waterproof wire nuts, sealed the connection box with a heavy rubber gasket, and screwed the cover plate down tight. It was no longer a plug-in appliance. It was a hard-wired, integrated utility feature of my property. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my eyes. I looked at my watch. It was 3:45 p.m. I had 1 hour and 15 minutes before Brenda's arbitrary deadline expired, and the fines kicked in. I walked over to the side of my house, opened the main electrical panel, and found the brand new breaker switch Steve had labeled Dragon. I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. The climax of the most ridiculous, petty, and expensive weekend of my life. I flipped the switch. Instantly, the low, powerful rumble of the commercial blower motor echoed across the yard. The sound was muffled slightly by the concrete, vibrating up through the slab. In the center of the yard, the wrinkled puddle of brightly colored vinyl began to twitch. The intake tube swelled, air rushing into the chambers with a high-pitched whistling sound. Slowly, majestically, the massive orange turrets began to rise from the ground. The walls expanded, snapping taut with a loud pop. And then the dragon's head rose, its neck inflated, lifting up into the clear blue sky, towering 15 feet above the concrete pad. Its painted eyes stared out over the pristine lawns of Whispering Pines, a massive, brightly colored beacon of absolute defiance. I walked back over to the pad. The inflatable was rigid, fully pressurized. I grabbed one of the corner pillars and pulled on it with all my weight. It didn't even wiggle. The combination of the heavy concrete foundation and the steel wedge anchors made it feel like I was pushing against a brick wall. It was permanent. It was undeniable. I grabbed my lawn chair, placed it right in the center of the patio, and cracked open a fresh, sparkling water. I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 4:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the deadline, Brenda marched around the side of her house. She was not alone. She had brought backup. Flanking her were 2 other members of the HOA board, a timid-looking man named Gary, who acted as the treasurer, and a severe-looking woman named Susan, who ran the landscaping committee. They looked like a tribunal arriving to pass judgment. Brenda was holding her silver clipboard, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. She was fully prepared to hand me my first $500 fine. She marched up to the property line, her eyes fixed on her clipboard, totally focused on the legal delivery she was about to perform. "David," Brenda started, her voice ringing out clearly across the grass. "It is currently 4:55 on Friday. As per the emergency amendment to Section 14, Paragraph B of the Master Covenant, your time to comply has—" She finally looked up from her clipboard. Her sentence died in her throat. The smug smile evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. Gary, the treasurer, let out a small, high-pitched gasp. Susan simply stopped dead in her tracks, staring up at the massive, vibrant dragon towering over them. The low hum of the hard-wired blower motor provided the perfect soundtrack to their mental collapse. What is that?" Brenda stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the bounce house. "That," I said, gesturing grandly with my sparkling water, "is a fully permitted, municipal code-compliant, permanent accessory structure. Welcome to the neighborhood." Brenda's eyes darted from the dragon to the concrete slab, noting the heavy steel bolts and the hard-wired electrical box. Her brain was desperately trying to process the visual information, trying to find a way to make it fit into her neat, organized, heavily regulated worldview. You bolted it down," she whispered, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on her. "I didn't just bolt it down, Brenda," I smiled, stepping closer to the property line. I poured 36 inches of continuous concrete footings below the frost line. I hardwired the power source directly into my home's electrical grid via a subterranean conduit. I had the municipal building inspector out here an hour ago to sign off on the final certificate of completion. I pulled the signed certificate from my pocket and held it up for the tribunal to see. "As per your own updated bylaws," I continued, savoring every single syllable, "the HOA strictly defers to the Des Moines Municipal Zoning and Building Code for the definition of a permanent structure. According to the city, this is no longer a temporary inflatable recreational device. It is a legally permanent fixture of this property. It is no different than a detached garage or a brick-and-mortar shed. Your temporary structure ban is entirely irrelevant." Gary, the treasurer, looked at Brenda, his face pale. "Brenda, is he right? Did the city classify it as permanent?" Brenda was hyperventilating. She looked down at her clipboard, reading the exact phrasing of the rule she had forced through on Monday. The rule she was so proud of. The rule she thought was airtight. "It's a balloon!" she screamed, her voice cracking in hysterical frustration. "It's a giant, obnoxious, primary-colored balloon! It can't be permanent!" "Take it up with the city inspector," I shrugged. He seemed to think the half-inch steel wedge anchors made it pretty permanent. Susan, the landscaping committee head, stepped forward, her face twisted in a scowl. "We will just draft another amendment. We will ban permanent inflatables." "You can try," I laughed. "But as you well know, HOA bylaws are not retroactive. You can't pass a rule tomorrow to ban a structure that was legally erected and permitted today. It's called a grandfather clause, Susan. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. My dragon is legally protected under the grandest of grandfather clauses." Brenda looked like she was about to cry, or punch me, or possibly both. The absolute, unyielding power of her clipboard had been shattered. She had tried to use the law as a weapon to bully me into submission, and I had simply grabbed the weapon out of her hand and hit her over the head with it. "You are a monster," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling. "You have ruined this neighborhood." "I haven't ruined anything, Brenda," I said, my voice losing the playful snark and becoming dead serious. "I just wanted to let my nephew bounce in my backyard for a weekend. You are the one who decided to turn it into a legal war. You wanted to play with municipal codes and hyper-specific legal definitions? Well, congratulations. You won. You successfully forced me to build a permanent structure." I took a step back, gesturing to the 15-foot dragon. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go test the structural integrity of my new permanent addition. Have a great weekend, everyone." I turned my back on the tribunal, walked up the steps of the concrete pad, and climbed into the bounce house. The heavy vinyl felt amazing under my feet. I started to jump, bouncing higher and higher, the bright orange walls echoing with the thud of my victory. I looked over the mesh netting at the top of the castle. Brenda, Gary, and Susan were still standing on the property line, staring at me in silent, defeated horror. I gave them a massive, exaggerated wave at the peak of my highest jump. They turned around and walked slowly back to Brenda's house, a broken, defeated army retreating from a battle they never fully understood. The dragon lived on, and as far as the city of Des Moines and the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association were concerned, it was going to live on forever.